The morning they came to take everything, Jennie Reed stood in the yard with her hands folded in front of her apron and watched them load her husband's plows onto a stranger's wagon without making a single sound. It was the autumn of 1873, in the flat and wind-bitten reaches of central Kansas, where the prairie rolled in great brown waves toward a horizon that never seemed to get any closer no matter how far you rode. The sky that October morning was the color of pale dishwater. Thin clouds stretched across it like gauze over an old wound, and the cottonwood trees along the creek bed had already surrendered most of their leaves. Dust moved in slow curls across the yard. The auction had begun at 7:30, and by 9 o'clock there was almost nothing left. Jennie was 31 years old, and she had been a widow for exactly 43 days. She knew the number because she had been counting them, not out of grief alone, but because each day was a small, terrible proof that she was still standing, that Thomas Reed was truly gone, that the diphtheria had taken him as fast and as carelessly as a hawk takes a sparrow, with no warning and no ceremony, just a sound one moment and silence the next. He had been 40 years old, strong as a fence post, and dead by the following Tuesday. They had no children. That was the cruelest part, people told her, as if she did not already know. No children meant no help. No help meant no way to work the land alone. No way to work the land meant debts she could not pay, and debts she could not pay meant the bank in Caldwell had sent men to stand in her yard and sell off everything that Thomas had spent 12 years building. She watched them take the seed drill. She watched them take the iron-wheeled cultivator that Thomas had saved for 2 seasons to purchase. She watched a red-faced man she did not know pay $4.70 for Thomas's good leather harness and walk away with it slung over his shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. Jennie did not cry. She had told herself she would not, and she did not. She stood straight and she kept her hands folded and she watched it all go. By mid-morning the stock had been driven off. The 2 draft horses, Chester and Gray, went to a farmer from Sumner County who paid a fair price and at least had the decency not to meet her eyes. The milk cow went next, and then the 3 hogs, and then the chickens, all of them herded and crated and carried away, while Jennie stood and counted the dollars being pressed into the auctioneer's ledger book. What she would be left with, once the bank's portion was settled, was $112, a saddle horse named Biscuit that was technically in her brother's name and therefore exempt from the sale, the farmhouse itself which was paid free and clear, because Thomas had been a careful and proud man, and whatever she could carry out of it. The auctioneer, a bony man named Ferris who smelled of pipe tobacco, came to her just before noon with his hat in his hands and his ledger tucked under his arm and told her the totals and asked her to sign the papers confirming the sale was completed. She signed. He said he was sorry for her loss. She thanked him. He left. And then they were all gone. The yard was empty. The wagon ruts in the soft earth were all that proved any of them had been there at all. The cottonwoods moved in the wind. A single rooster belonging to a neighbor called out from somewhere down the road far off and then was silent. Jennie stood in the yard for a long moment. Then she turned and walked toward the barn. It stood at the edge of the lot, south-facing, the boards weathered to a soft gray that was almost silver in certain lights. Thomas had built it himself in the summer of 1862, before they were married, with the help of 3 neighbors who had since moved on or died. He had been proud of that barn. He had kept it clean and well organized, with pegs for the harness and a swept floor and good ventilation cut high in the walls. He had loved it the way men love the things they make with their own hands. She pushed the door open on its iron hinges. It swung wide and the light came in behind her and fell across the empty floor in a long, pale rectangle. There was nothing left inside. The stalls were empty. The pegs were bare. The feed bins had been emptied and even the pitchforks had been sold. The smell of horses and hay and old wood remained, that deep animal smell that clung to weathered timber the way memory clings to the mind, but everything else was gone. Jennie stepped inside. Her boots made a hollow sound on the board floor. She walked to the middle of the barn and stopped and stood there with her hands at her sides. She did not cry. She looked at the empty stalls and the bare walls and the single shaft of light coming down from the high ventilation gap, and she breathed in the smell of what had been, and she pressed her lips together and held herself very still. And then she heard boots on the threshold. She turned, one hand moving instinctively to her collar, and she saw a man standing in the open doorway with the autumn light behind him. He was tall, lean in the way that working men are lean rather than gaunt, with wide shoulders and a hat pulled low over dark eyes. He wore a canvas coat the color of dried sage, trail-worn boots, and a pistol on his right hip that he clearly hadn't drawn in some time given the unsnapped leather of the holster. He held his hat in his hands, the way the auctioneer had, but there was nothing apologetic or perfunctory about it. He held his hat as if he meant it. She had never seen him before in her life. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to startle you. The yard was empty. I knocked at the house, but nobody answered." His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that came from a man who chose his words before he spoke them. "Who are you?" Jennie asked. Her own voice came out steadier than she expected. "Ralph Sawyer," he said. "I used to ride with your husband, with Thomas. We worked together on the Kisham route for 3 seasons before he settled here. I heard what happened. I rode up from Wichita when I got the word." She stared at him. The name meant something, some distant memory of Thomas saying it at the supper table, a story about a cattle drive, a man who'd kept his sense of humor through a bad river crossing. But she couldn't place the details now. "Thomas talked about you," she said. "He was a good man," Ralph Sawyer said. "One of the best I ever knew." And that was when something broke open inside her, not the words themselves, though they were true, not the kindness in the way he said them, though that was real. It was something else, something about a stranger standing in her empty barn holding his hat and meaning it, looking at the bare walls and the empty stalls with eyes that understood what they represented, that understood the weight of what was gone. Something about not being alone in that space anymore. The tears came without any warning at all. They simply arrived, as if they had been waiting behind a door she'd kept locked for 43 days and someone had finally turned the key. She pressed her hand to her mouth and turned away from him because she hadn't wanted anyone to see it, hadn't wanted to give anyone the satisfaction of her grief, but she could not stop it. She could not stop it at all. She heard him move. He did not say anything and he did not come too close. He simply crossed the barn floor and stood a few feet from her, close enough that she was not alone in it, far enough that he gave her room. She cried for a long time. She cried for Thomas and for the horses and for the seed drill and for the 12 years of hard work sold off in a morning. She cried for the children she had never had and the life that was supposed to have kept going. She cried because she was 31 years old and the thing she'd built her whole world around was standing empty. When it finally passed, she wiped her face with the back of her wrist and turned around. Ralph Sawyer was still there, hat in hand, watching her with those dark, steady eyes. He did not look uncomfortable. He did not look as if he pitied her in any way she needed to resent. He just looked like a man who had stayed because staying was the right thing to do. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't intend to do that." "You've got nothing to apologize for," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment, then looked around at the empty barn again. "I've been holding that since the first day," she said. 43 of them." "I know," he said. "I could tell." She didn't ask him how he could tell. She supposed it was obvious enough. They stood in silence for a moment, and the wind moved against the barn walls, and somewhere outside a sparrow called out once and went quiet. "I haven't got anything to offer you," Jennie said. "The house is bare, practically. I can heat some water for coffee if there's any left in the tin." "Don't trouble yourself," Ralph said. "It's no trouble," she said, and she meant it. The ordinary business of hospitality was something to do, something to put her hands to, and she needed that right now more than she needed anything else. She led him out of the barn and across the yard to the house. The farmhouse was a solid, square-built structure of cottonwood lumber and plaster, with a porch along the front and a summer kitchen attached at the rear. Inside, it was neat despite its relative emptiness, because Jennie was a neat woman and Thomas had been a neat man. The furniture that remained was what had been hers before the marriage: a rocking chair, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, a bed frame, and a chest of drawers. The shelves held a few jars of preserved tomatoes and dried beans and a half-empty tin of coffee. There was a good iron stove and enough wood beside it to last the week. She set the coffee on and sat across the table from Ralph Sawyer and looked at him in the better light of the kitchen. He was somewhere near her own age, she thought. Maybe 33 or 34, with a face that had been out in the weather long enough to show it. There was a scar along his jaw, old and faded, from something she didn't ask about. His hands on the table were working hands, calloused and marked but careful in the way he held them. "How far did you ride?" she asked. "From Wichita," he said. "Got word from Hank Billings, who runs the feed store there. He knew Thomas and I had worked together." "That's 30 miles," she said. "About that," he agreed. She poured the coffee when it was ready and set a tin cup in front of him and sat back down. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at her over it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Not in the way that people had been asking her, with that particular undertone of concern that was really just curiosity about whether she would be a problem, whether she would need helping, or would she quietly go somewhere else. He asked it the way a man asks a question he actually wants to hear the answer to. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I've got the house. I've got $112. I've got biscuit." She paused. "I can sew and I can cook and I know enough about farming to plant a kitchen garden. I suppose I'll find a way." "What about family?" he asked. "My brother is in Dodge City," she said. "He's offered to take me in." "But his wife is—" She stopped herself and started again. "It would be a difficult situation and I don't want to leave this place." Ralph looked at her steadily. "Because of Thomas," he said. "Because of what we built here," she corrected gently. "Thomas is gone. The place isn't." He nodded slowly, as if that made more sense to him than any other thing she might have said. She had a feeling that a man who had spent years moving cattle across open country understood something about the difference between a person and a place, and how sometimes the place was the last thing left to hold on to. "I could help," he said. She looked at him. "I don't mean charity," he said quickly, and she could see that he meant what he said and that it mattered to him that she understood it that way. "I mean work. I've been thinking about settling. I've got some money saved, enough to lease a spread or hire on somewhere, but I haven't found the right situation. There's a small parcel to the north of your property, the old Gerber place. I saw it coming in. It looked like it's been sitting empty a season." She knew the Gerber place. Old Emil Gerber had gone back east 2 years prior when his eyesight failed. The land wasn't being worked. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "Nothing complicated," he said. "Let me lease Gerber's land. I'll run some cattle. If you're willing, I'll hire on to help you put your place back in order, proper wages, nothing owed and nothing expected. You keep what's yours, I keep what's mine." She studied him across the table. He met her gaze without flinching, which she respected. "Why?" she asked. "Because Thomas Reed was the best trail partner I ever had," Ralph Sawyer said, "and I couldn't do anything when he died, and I can do something now." She was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked with heat. Outside, the wind moved across the flat land and rattled the porch boards. "All right," she said, "but proper wages if there are wages to pay. I won't have it otherwise." "Agreed," he said. He stayed 3 days that first visit, sleeping in the empty barn on the bedroll he carried behind his saddle. And in those 3 days, he cut and stacked enough firewood to see her through November, repaired the porch step that had been loose for a year, patched the gap in the garden fence where the Hendersons' pigs had gotten through in the spring, and rode into town with her to inquire about the Gerber lease. The Gerber land was available through a land agent in Caldwell named Morrison, a whiskery man with ink-stained fingers who seemed surprised to have a customer, but managed to be professionally cheerful about it. Ralph paid the first quarter's lease in cash, signed the papers, and rode back out to the property to walk the fence line while Jennie bought flour and salt pork at the mercantile. She watched him ride out through the window of Caldwell's general store and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not quite relief, because relief was too simple a word for it. Something more complicated. Something that had to do with the fact that a stranger had ridden 30 miles and stayed and worked and asked for almost nothing, and it had not felt strange at all. It had felt, in some way she could not yet articulate, like the most natural thing in the world. She bought her flour and her salt pork and a small bag of dried apricots as a small luxury, and she rode home in the thin October sunshine and thought about Ralph Sawyer, and did not know yet what to do with what she was thinking. He left on the 4th day to go back to Wichita and collect his gear and his horse and the small arrangements that needed making before he could properly settle. He stood in the yard with his horse saddled and his bedroll tied, and he shook her hand when he said goodbye, formal and respectful, and she noticed that he held her hand a moment longer than the handshake strictly required before he let it go. "I'll be back inside 2 weeks," he said. "I'll be here," she said. She watched him ride south until he was a small shape against the gray-brown prairie and then gone. Then she went inside and set her hands on the kitchen table and breathed carefully for a moment before she got on with the business of the afternoon. He was back in 11 days, which was 3 days sooner than he'd said. He came in the late afternoon with 2 good horses and a pack mule loaded with gear, and he tipped his hat at the end of the lane and rode on past to the Gerber property without stopping, except to call out that he would come by in the morning. She stood on the porch and watched him go and felt something warm move through her chest that she told herself was simply the satisfaction of a plan coming together. In the morning he came by early, while the frost was still on the grass, and she had coffee ready and biscuits in the oven, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about the land and the winter ahead and what he thought of the Gerber fences and what she knew about the soil conditions along the North Draw. And it was not until she poured the second cup of coffee that she realized she had been talking for 20 minutes without once thinking about Thomas. She set the coffee pot down and was quiet for a moment. Ralph noticed. He noticed most things she was beginning to understand. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then, because it seemed important to be honest with this man, she said, "I was just thinking that I hadn't thought about Thomas for a little while, and then I thought about thinking about it." He turned his cup in his hands. "That's not wrong," he said. "That's not any kind of betrayal." "I know," she said. "I know it in my head." "The rest of you'll catch up," he said. She looked at him. "Has it happened to you, losing someone?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father," he said, "when I was 17. A friend on the trail, a man named Cord, who drowned crossing the Cimarron in 69. He paused. "And someone else. A woman before I started trail work, but that's a different kind of loss." She didn't push. The way he said it told her enough. Someone he'd cared about, gone in some way that still carried a small weight even now. "I'm sorry," she said. "It's been a long time," he said, and she could tell that it was mostly true. The days settled into a rhythm that surprised her with its steadiness. Ralph worked the Gerber land during the mornings, putting up fence and assessing what cattle he might bring in come spring, and in the afternoons he came by the Reed place and worked whatever needed doing. He repaired the barn roof where 2 boards had sprung loose. He rehung the barn door that had been sitting crooked on its hinges for 2 seasons. He turned the kitchen garden under for winter and left it mounded properly against the frost. He never came inside without being invited, and he never stayed past supper unless she asked him to. And she found herself asking him to stay more often than not, because the evenings alone in the farmhouse had been the hardest thing about widowhood, harder even than the auction day, and his company was quiet and easy and did not press her in any direction. They talked in the evenings about everything and nothing. He told her about the cattle drives, the Kishom Trail running from Texas up through Indian Territory and into Kansas, the sheer brutal tedium of it punctuated by moments of genuine terror, the river crossings and the stampedes and the storms that came up out of nowhere on the open plain. He told her about the cowhands he'd ridden with, the good ones and the bad ones, the funny ones and the sad ones. He told her about the first time he'd seen the Cimarron River in full flood and thought he was going to die there. She told him about coming to Kansas from Ohio in 1860 with her parents, who had come for the land and the promise of it, and how they'd traveled by rail as far as the rail went, and then by wagon for 2 weeks, and how the prairie had terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She told him about meeting Thomas at a church social in Caldwell in the fall of 1861, and knowing fairly quickly that he was going to be important to her. She told him about the early years of the farm, the hard winters and the dry summers, and the year the grasshoppers came and ate the corn down to bare sticks, and they'd survived on salt pork and canned tomatoes until the following season's crop came in. She told him about the cattle drives Thomas had gone on in those early years, before the farm was established enough to stay, before she needed him home. She told him she'd been afraid every time he went, and how he'd always come back, and how she had grown to trust that he would, which was why it was so utterly unthinkable when the diphtheria took him instead, quietly, in the bed where she'd always felt safest. Ralph listened to all of it. He was one of those rare people who listened with his whole attention, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually taking in what you said, turning it over, making room for it. November came in cold and clear. The first hard frost killed what was left of the prairie grass and turned the world silver every morning until the sun came up and burned it off. Ralph had laid in good stores of hay for his horses from a farmer to the east, and he spent a week building a proper hay shelter on the Gerber land that would keep it dry through the wet season. One evening in mid-November he came by later than usual, coming in from a long day of fence work with cold hands and a tired set to his shoulders, and she had beef stew on the stove from a chunk of salt meat she traded 2 jars of tomatoes for, and she poured him a bowl before he even asked, and set it in front of him, and he looked up at her with something in his eyes that made her heart do a strange small thing she was not prepared for. "Thank you," he said, and it came out with a weight to it that went well beyond the stew. "You work hard," she said, sitting down across from him. "A man who works hard ought to be fed." He smiled at that. He didn't smile easily or often, but when he did it changed his whole face, made him look younger and less guarded, made her understand what he must have looked like before years of trail driving had put all that weather into him. They ate in comfortable silence for a while. The stove put out good heat and the kitchen was warm against the cold pressing in at the window glass. "Can I ask you something?" Ralph said. "You can ask," she said. "Are you lonely here?" He said it carefully, not as an accusation but as a genuine question. "I mean, truly, not just now with me here." She considered it. She looked at the window and the dark outside it and the small circle of lamplight that held them both. "Yes," she said, "I am, not in a way that makes me want to leave, but yes." He nodded. He turned his spoon in the bowl. "Me too," he said. "I've been lonely most of my life. Trail work's full of people, but it's a particular kind of lonely, being always in motion, never a place that's yours." She looked at him. "Is that why you settled?" "Partly," he said. He met her eyes. "Partly." She felt the heat of that partly. She felt it run right down through the center of her, and she was both scared by it and not scared at all, which was a confusing thing to feel simultaneously. She said nothing. He said nothing more. They finished the stew and he helped her wash the bowls, which no one had ever told him to do and which Thomas had never done, not because he was a bad man but because it simply hadn't occurred to him. Ralph Sawyer dried the bowls and set them on the shelf and said good night and walked out into the cold, and she stood in the kitchen after the door closed and pressed her hand flat against the tabletop and breathed. December brought snow. Not the blizzard kind, but the slow, steady kind that came down in fine crystals and accumulated silently over several days until the whole world was white and still, and the roads were drifted to the fences. Jennie was glad of the firewood. She was glad of the full larder. She was glad that the farmhouse had good thick walls. Ralph dug her out on the second morning, clearing the path from the porch to the barn, and the trail to the outhouse with a flat spade he'd found in the barn, working at it steadily in the quiet snowfall while she watched from the kitchen window with her coffee and felt something she was now having more trouble ignoring. She liked him. She more than liked him. She was beginning to understand this with a clarity that was both illuminating and frightening. She was beginning to understand that she thought about him during the parts of the day when he wasn't there, and that she looked forward to the evenings in a way that had nothing to do with loneliness and everything to do with him specifically. His voice, the way he moved, the way he listened, the way he held his hat. She was also aware that it had been less than 3 months since Thomas died, and she did not know what to do with that fact in relation to this other fact. She did not think loving someone new was a betrayal of someone dead. She believed that in principle, but there was a difference between principle and feeling, and the feeling was complicated. She had a long talk with herself about it one Sunday afternoon while the snow came down outside and the stove ticked and the rocking chair creaked under her, and what she arrived at ultimately was that she could not control what she felt. She could only control what she did about it, and what she was going to do about it, for now, was nothing. She was going to let things proceed as they were and see what grew. As it turned out, she did not have to wait very long to find out what Ralph Sawyer was feeling. It happened on a Thursday in mid-December, during a brief warm spell that melted the top layer of snow and turned everything soft and glistening in the winter sunlight. He had come by in the morning to check on the garden fence, which had taken some drift weight, and she had gone out to help him reset a post that had leaned in the frost heave. They were working side by side at the post, she holding it upright and he tamping the soil back around the base, and at some point she shifted her grip and their hands touched on the post and neither of them moved away. They held there for a moment, both hands on the cold wood, and then he looked up at her and she looked at him and there was nothing ambiguous about what was in his face. "Jennie," he said, just her name, nothing else. She held his gaze. Her heart was going at a rate that was probably visible through her coat. "I know it's too soon," he said. He straightened up, letting go of the post. She held it on her own. "I know that, and I don't say this as any kind of pressure on you, but I can't keep coming here every day and not tell you that." He stopped and took a breath and started again. "I think about you. I think about you all day, and I look forward to seeing you every evening, and I have not felt like this in a very long time, maybe ever." She set the post carefully and stepped back from it. The winter air was bright and cold around them. The snow was melting off the garden fence in thin trickles. "How long have you felt this way?" she asked. Her voice was steady. He thought about it. "Since the barn," he said. "Since that first day when you cried and couldn't stop and turned away from me. I don't know why, it might sound strange, but I thought there is someone who loves what she loves with her whole self, and I wanted." He shook his head. "I don't know, I wanted to be something you loved that way." She was quiet for a long moment. A blue jay called from the cottonwood near the creek and then went silent. "I'm going to need some time," she said. "Not because I don't," she stopped and chose her words carefully. "Not because what you've said is one-sided. But because I want to do this right. I want to be sure that I'm coming to you whole and not just because I'm frightened and alone." He nodded at once. "That's all I'd ever ask," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know," she said, and she did know it. That was the remarkable thing about Ralph Sawyer. She knew it completely. They finished the fence post and went back inside for coffee and talked about whether the thaw would hold through the weekend. And it was ordinary and easy and somehow more tender than if they'd embraced right there in the garden. Because there was a care in it, a deliberateness, that told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was. Christmas came and went quietly. She had no money for gifts and he had no expectation of any, but he brought her a small wrapped parcel on Christmas morning, and when she opened it, she found a set of 3 good steel sewing needles in a card paper envelope, because she'd mentioned once that her old ones were down to 2 and both bent. It was the most practical, and therefore the most perfectly right gift anyone had ever given her, and she had to look away for a moment to compose herself. She gave him a jar of the preserved tomatoes she'd put up before the auction, the last 4 jars on the shelf. He received them as if she'd given him something valuable, which in the winter they essentially were. They ate Christmas dinner together at her table, and she made a proper meal of it. A salt pork roast with dried apple stuffing and potatoes, and the biscuits she'd gotten good at over 12 years of practice. And they sat across from each other in the lamplight and talked until late, and it was the happiest evening she had spent in longer than she could clearly remember. January was cold in the way that January in Kansas was always cold, which was an absolute kind of cold that got into the walls and the floor and the marrow of your bones, and simply lived there. Ralph cut more firewood and stacked it against her porch wall, and she kept the stove burning, and they both endured it the way people in Kansas endured all things, stubbornly and without much complaint. One morning in late January, he came by to find that her roof had developed a leak over the main room where a shingle had been worked loose by the thaw and refreeze cycle, and a spot of the plaster ceiling had gotten wet and was threatening to come down. He went up on the roof in the bitter cold with a handful of replacement shingles and a hammer and fixed it in 2 hours while she stood below and handed things up when he asked. And when he came down, his hands were half frozen, and she took them both in hers and held them until the blood came back, rubbing them between her palms, and he stood there and let her and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "Thank you," he said, again with that weight. "Stop thanking me for basic human decency," she said, but she was smiling when she said it. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh outright, and it was a good sound, low and warm, and it made her smile wider. "I'll try," he said. She was still holding his hands. She realized she had been holding them long past when they'd needed warming. She let them go and went inside to make coffee, and he followed her, and neither of them mentioned it directly. But that evening after supper, sitting by the stove with his coffee cooling in his hands and the winter wind going along the eaves, he said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said from the rocking chair. "The woman I told you about, the one before trail work." He paused. "Her name was Clara. She married someone else. Her father thought I didn't have enough to offer, which was probably fair at the time. I was 19 and I owned a horse and a saddle and not much else." He turned his cup. "I'm 34 now and I've got a leased farm and some money saved and a year's worth of plans I haven't started yet. I don't say that to brag. I say it because I want you to know that I've been moving towards something. I just didn't know what it was until recently." Jennie looked at him across the warm, small kitchen. The lamplight moved on the walls. "What are you saying, Ralph?" she asked. He set his cup down. He looked at her directly. "I'm saying that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I would like to court you properly. I would like to do this the right way, with your permission and at your pace, and see if what I believe is possible between us is actually possible." She did not answer right away. She rocked slowly in the chair and listened to the winter wind and looked at him, this man who had ridden 30 miles when he heard about a loss that wasn't his and stayed and worked and asked for almost nothing and looked at her like she was something worth looking at. "Yes," she said finally, "I'd like that." The word of it was simple and small, but it sat between them in the warm kitchen air like something that had just been built, something solid. He smiled. That good, rare, face-changing smile. "All right then," he said. He left that night the same way he always left, with a proper good night at the door, hat in his hands. But this time when he said good night, there was something different in it, something that acknowledged what had been said and was quiet and pleased about it. And she stood at the closed door for a moment after he'd gone and put her hands against the wood and let herself be glad. February was hard. A blizzard came down from the north in the first week and pinned her in the house for 4 days. And Ralph couldn't get through the drifts on the road between the Gerber land and the Reed farm. And she was alone with the stove and her sewing and her thoughts for longer than she was comfortable with. On the 3rd day she ran low on firewood and had to dig through the drift on the porch to reach the stacked cord wood, which was miserable work in the wind. And she did it and felt proud of herself, and also grimly aware that pride alone didn't make it any less cold. On the 5th day, the wind dropped and Ralph appeared at her lane on his horse, coming through the remnant drifts at a careful walk, with a bundle of extra firewood across the saddle in front of him. She saw him from the window and went out onto the porch before he'd even tied up, which she was aware said something about how much she'd missed him, and she said so before she could think better of it. "I missed you," she said from the porch. "These last 4 days it was a long 4 days." He tied up and came to the porch steps with the firewood in his arms and looked up at her. "I couldn't get through sooner," he said. "I tried the 2nd day and turned back. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said. "You're here now." She said it naturally and didn't think about it until after he'd carried the wood inside and they were both warming up by the stove, and then she thought about it and felt her face go warm, and when she looked over at him, she found he was watching her with a quietly delighted expression. "I'm here now," he agreed. She threw a dish towel at him, and he caught it and laughed, and she thought, standing there in her kitchen in February with a man who had ridden through post-blizzard drifts with an armload of firewood, that she was dangerously close to being in love with him, that she might already be there, that the 43 days of counting and holding and not crying and all the months since might have been leading here as surely as a road leads somewhere, even when you can't see the destination. March came in mild. The prairie began to green around the edges of the fields, and the cottonwoods along the creek put out their first cautious leaves. Ralph brought in 12 cattle from a sale in Wichita and started working them on the Gerber land, and she watched him work sometimes from her garden fence, enjoying the way he was with the animals, firm and patient and competent. She began planting her kitchen garden in the 2nd week of March. She ordered seed from the Caldwell Mercantile and put in tomatoes and beans and squash and a long row of sweet corn along the south-facing fence where it would get the afternoon light. Working the soil was good. It was clean and purposeful, hands in the dirt, seeds in the ground, the simple faith of planting something and expecting it to come up. She had a visitor in mid-March that she hadn't expected. Thomas's older brother, a man named Warren Reed who lived in Wichita, rode out to see her on what he said was a social call but was transparently something else. He sat in her kitchen and drank her coffee and made polite conversation for 20 minutes before he got to the point of it, which was that he was concerned about her living alone on the farm, and he thought she ought to consider selling the property and moving into town. "I'm managing," she told him. "You're managing now," Warren said. He was a well-meaning man, she believed that, but there was a quality in his concern that had more to do with his own discomfort about a widowed sister-in-law living alone on a Kansas farm than about her actual well-being. "But the spring, Jennie, and the summer. You can't work this land alone." "I'm not alone," she said. "I have arrangements." He raised his eyebrows. "What kind of arrangements?" She told him about Ralph Sawyer simply and directly, that he was a man who had worked with Thomas on the cattle drives and had taken the lease on the Gerber land and was helping her in exchange for wages when there were wages to pay. Warren's eyebrows went progressively higher during this explanation. "And this man, you know him well enough to trust him," Warren said. "I do," she said. "How long have you known him?" "Since October," she said. Warren set his cup down. "Jennie," he said carefully, "you know what people will say." She looked at him across the table. "I know what some people will say," she said. "Those people are not living my life, Warren. They are not the ones who had to stand in the yard and watch everything sold off. They are not the ones who spent the winter alone in this house. I appreciate your concern, I truly do, but I am 31 years old and I know my own mind." He stayed for another hour and left without quite resolving his concern, but she could see that he had at least heard her, and she was satisfied enough with that. She did not want his blessing exactly, but she didn't want to fight with Thomas's family either, and she felt that she'd managed the middle path reasonably well. She told Ralph about it that evening. He listened and then said, "Is it going to be a problem?" "Not if I don't let it," she said. He nodded. "People will talk regardless," he said. "I know that. I don't want to be the cause of any difficulty for you." "You're not the cause of difficulty," she said firmly. "You're the opposite of difficulty. You're the reason I got through the winter." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I want to take you somewhere on Sunday if the weather holds, somewhere I found that I think you'll like." "Where?" she asked. "It's a surprise," he said. She had not been told something was a surprise by anyone in a very long time. She found that she liked it considerably. On Sunday the weather held clear and bright, one of those perfect early spring days that Kansas offered occasionally, as if in apology for everything else. He came by at mid-morning with both horses saddled, Biscuit for her and his own roan gelding he called Ford, and she put on her good riding coat and her hat, and they rode north together across the prairie. He led her along the creek bed, and then up through a shallow draw she'd never had reason to explore, following it for perhaps 2 miles until it opened out onto a small rise above the plain. From there the view spread in every direction, the silver-gray thread of the creek below, the patchwork of fields and grass to the south and east, the long blue distance of the Flint Hills to the east, and overhead a sky so blue and clear it almost hurt to look at. There was a single large cottonwood on the rise, old and spreading, its new leaves catching the spring light. "I come here sometimes in the evening," Ralph said. He was looking at the view, not at her. "I find it steadies me. All that distance reminds you that your problems are a particular size and not bigger than that." She looked out at it all. The wind moved through the new cottonwood leaves. The plain stretched south toward where she knew her farm was, toward where her barn stood, the barn that was no longer empty because Ralph had used it for his tools and spare equipment with her permission, and it smelled of leather and oil again and no longer echoed. "It's beautiful," she said. "I thought you should know about it," he said simply. "It seemed like something you'd want to know about." She looked at him then, this man sitting on his roan horse beside her on a small rise in Kansas in the spring of 1874, with the wind in his hat and the morning light on his face. She thought about 43 days. She thought about the empty barn and the first tears. She thought about firewood and fence posts and sewing needles and blizzards and the way he said good night. "Ralph," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not waiting anymore," she said. "I know what I feel and I know it's real. I'm not confused and I'm not frightened and I'm not holding on to you because I'm alone. I'm holding on to you because you're—" she stopped and found the true word. "Because you're you, because there's no one else like you that I've ever known." He was very still on his horse. "I love you," she said. "I know it's fast and I know it's complicated and I know all the things people will say, but it's true. So I'm saying it." He moved toward her then, closing the small distance between their horses, and he reached across and took her face in his hands, those working man's hands that were rough and warm, and he kissed her. It was a careful kiss, gentle and deliberate and absolutely certain of itself, and she brought her hands up and held onto his coat and felt the whole long, difficult year of her life shift and settle into something new. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment. His eyes were closed. "I love you," he said. "I have for months, and it's been the best and the most difficult thing to carry." She laughed, surprised by her own laughter, by the joy of it. He opened his eyes and smiled, and she thought for the 100th time that his smile was the best thing she had ever seen. They rode back to the farm in the spring sunshine, and she made lunch and they sat on the porch afterward in the good warmth, and he held her hand and they talked about everything all over again as if the world had just been remade, which in some important way it had. Spring came in earnest. The garden put up good shoots. Ralph's cattle settled on the Gerber land, and he hired a hand, a young man named Devereaux who was 19 and eager, and came with a letter of recommendation from a rancher in Wichita. Devereaux bunked in the old Gerber farmhouse, which needed work but was sound enough, and took his noon meals at Jennie's table along with Ralph, and she found she liked having people in the house again. It had a fullness to it that the emptiness of winter had made her forget she'd been missing. She had another visitor in April, one that was considerably more welcome than Warren Reed. Her friend Mabel Hoyt, who had been her nearest neighbor when Mabel lived on the property to the west, had moved to Caldwell the previous year when her husband took a job at the mill, and Mabel rode out on a borrowed horse one fine April afternoon specifically to see Jennie, and specifically, She said within 5 minutes of arriving because she had heard things. Good things or bad things? Jennie asked, pouring tea. Interesting things, Mabel said. She was a compact, cheerful woman of 35 with red-brown hair and an honest face. That you have a man settled on the Gerber land who comes and goes from your place like a husband. Now, I'm not here to reproach you, I want to be clear about that. I'm here because you're my friend and I wanted to see for myself whether you were all right and whether whoever this man is was treating you well. He is, Jennie said. He's the best man I've known since Thomas. Mabel looked at her with sharp, kind eyes. Are you in love with him? Yes, Jennie said simply. Mabel sat back and smiled. Good, she said. Tell me about him. So Jennie told her all of it from the morning of the auction through to the spring, and Mabel listened with the attentiveness of a real friend and asked the right questions and made the right sounds, and at the end of it said, "When is he going to ask you to marry him?" Jennie set her teacup down. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know if we haven't talked about it specifically." "Well," said Mabel practically, "it seems to me that a man who is already halfway living on your property and fixing your roof and teaching your garden to grow and looking at you the way you say he looks at you is probably thinking about it." Jennie found this both reassuring and nerve-wracking, which was a combination she was getting used to when it came to Ralph Sawyer. As it turned out, Mabel's assessment was accurate. Ralph had been thinking about it. He asked her on an evening in early May, when the kitchen garden was up, and the cattle were doing well and young Devereux had proven reliable enough that Ralph didn't have to be at the Gerber place every single moment. He came to supper and they ate and talked and cleaned up, and then he sat down and looked at her with that particular steadiness that she now understood was him preparing to say something that mattered. "I want to ask you something," he said. She sat across from him. Her hands were folded on the table. "I know it's been less than a year," he said. "I know that's fast and I know what people will say and I know that neither of us can control what other people think. But I also know that what's between us is real and it's solid and I'd rather build on it honestly than circle around it indefinitely." He paused. "I want you to be my wife, Jennie. I want to marry you and make a real life here with you, a proper life, and I want it more than I've ever wanted anything." She looked at his face across the table, the lamplight, the warm kitchen, the smell of coffee and the sound of the spring wind outside. "Yes," she said. "Ralph, yes." He let out a breath that she realized he'd been holding, and she felt her own shoulders come down from where they'd been, up around her ears with the emotion of it. He reached across the table and took both her hands and held them, and she held his back, and they sat that way for a while in the kitchen with the lamp burning between them and did not need to say anything else. They were married in June at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, which was a simple enough building of whitewashed boards with a good iron bell that rang clearly on the morning of the ceremony. It was not a large wedding. Mabel Hoyt was there with her husband. Young Devereux came in his best shirt and looked touched by the whole thing. Warren Reed came from Wichita, which surprised Jennie, and he shook Ralph's hand with what appeared to be genuine goodwill, which surprised her more. A handful of neighbors came, people who had watched Jennie survive the winter and had drawn their own conclusions about what kind of woman she was and were apparently ready to wish her well. The minister was a lean, earnest man named Caldecott who said the right words and meant them. Ralph stood beside her in his good coat, the one she'd helped him brush down the night before, and he looked at her when they exchanged their vows the way he always looked at her, directly and completely, as if there was nothing in the room worth looking at except her. She said her vows without her voice shaking, which she'd been worried about, and she held his hand and felt the ring he'd chosen, a simple gold band that he'd ordered from the jeweler in Wichita, settle onto her finger and felt it as a weight that was entirely welcome. After the ceremony, there was a modest celebration at Mabel's house in town, with food that various people had brought and lemonade, and a fiddle player from down the street who came by when he heard the noise and played 4 songs before anyone paid him anything. Jennie danced with Ralph to the second song, a slow waltz that the fiddle player rendered in slightly wobbly fashion, and she put her hand on his shoulder and felt him settle his around her waist, and thought that this was what solid felt like. This was what it felt like when the thing you were building was real. They rode home to the farm that evening in the long June twilight, side by side, not saying much. The prairie was green and the sky was a deep luminous blue, and the cottonwoods along the creek were full and dark against it. She looked at the farmhouse as they came down the lane, with the lamp burning in the window because Devereux had come ahead to light it for them, and she thought about the morning of the auction and the empty barn and the 43 days and the man who had walked in. "I want to say something to you," she said as they pulled up at the barn. He turned in the saddle and looked at her. "I know why you came that day," she said. "You came because of Thomas, because of loyalty, because you're a man who honors his obligations to the people he cares about. But what I want you to know is that whatever reason brought you here, you became something completely your own when you stayed. You're not here because of Thomas, you're here because of you." And she pressed her lips together for a moment. "I need you to know that I see you, Ralph Sawyer, not his friend, you." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him being moved by it, he who was not easy to move. "No one has ever said that to me before," he said. "Not in my life." "Well," she said, "it's true." He dismounted and came around and held her horse while she got down, and then he stood there in the June evening with his hand on her back and the first stars coming out overhead and the lamp burning in the window of her house, their house, and said quietly, "I know exactly where I am." "Where?" she asked. "Home," he said. The first year of their marriage was the hardest and the best simultaneously, the way first years of things often are. There was the business of combining two lives and two adjacent properties, and figuring out how to run both, which required decisions and disagreements and the particular intimacy of solving problems together. There were decisions about the cattle and decisions about the garden and decisions about whether to plant the lower field in wheat the following season, and whether the Gerber farmhouse ought to be repaired properly for Devereux's use or left to eventually fall in on itself. They argued occasionally about small things and resolved them, which she found was actually one of the more satisfying aspects of being married to Ralph, because he argued honestly and without cruelty, and was willing to be wrong when he was wrong, and so was she. They never went to bed angry, which was a rule she'd had in her first marriage and brought to her second, and which Ralph adopted without being asked. By late summer she knew she was expecting. She sat with that knowledge for 3 days before she told him, turning it over in her mind, feeling the enormity of it. Not fear exactly, though there was some of that. More a vast, aching tenderness about the fact that this was happening, that this new life had found its way into this new life she and Ralph were making. She told him on a Sunday evening. He was on the porch, watching the last of the light go out of the western sky, and she came out and sat in the chair beside him and said, "I think we're going to have a baby." He turned to look at her. His face went very still. "When?" he said. "February or March," she said. "I haven't spoken to a doctor yet, but I'm fairly certain." He reached over and took her hand, very gently, the way he'd held things in the early days when he was being careful with her. He looked at her with an expression that she had no single word for. It was so many things at once. Joy and fear and wonder and something that went so deep it didn't have a name. "Are you all right?" he asked. "More than all right," she said. "Good," he said. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, and then held it against his chest, against the front of his coat, and she could feel his heartbeat through the fabric. They sat on the porch until the stars were out and the coyotes started up somewhere to the north, the thin wailing sound of them carrying across the dark plain, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they sat in the good dark together. Fall came around again, the first anniversary of the auction, the first anniversary of the barn. She thought about it as she worked the garden in for winter, turning the beds over in the cool October air. 1 year since the sale. 1 year since she had stood in the empty barn and thought the crying might split her in half. 1 year since Ralph Sawyer had walked in. She was thickening around the middle now, and her back ached some days, and she was tired in a way that was different from ordinary tired, a deeper, more fundamental tiredness, and she was also more content than she had been at any point she could clearly remember. It was a confusing combination that the women in Caldwell whom she'd spoken with about it all said was entirely normal, which she found comforting. Ralph was attentive without being suffocating, which was its own art. He noticed when she was tired and said so. He didn't hover. He made sure the firewood was in and the food was sufficient, and that she didn't lift anything heavy, and he did all of this without making a production of it, which she loved him for. She rode into Caldwell to see Dr. Ambrose, the physician who served the county, in November. He confirmed everything and said she was in good health and the child appeared to be well positioned, and she should expect a February delivery if his calculations were right. She thanked him and rode home with the news sitting bright and warm inside her like a lamp. That winter was milder than the previous one. There was snow, but not the blizzard kind, and the road between the properties stayed passable, and she was not alone at any point for longer than a few hours, which was a luxury she did not take for granted. Devereux proved out as a genuine hand that winter, taking on more responsibility with the cattle and freeing Ralph to spend more time at the farmhouse, which was where everyone tacitly agreed he should be. The baby came on the 22nd of February, in the cold blue of early morning, with Mabel Hoyt there to help and Dr. Ambrose making the ride out from Caldwell in time to oversee the final part of it. Ralph stayed in the kitchen with Devereux and they drank coffee and did not speak very much, and he wore a path in the kitchen floor that took several weeks to fade. The baby was a boy. A solid, wide-awake, extremely opinionated boy who came into the world with a full set of lungs and immediately used them. Mabel brought him out to Ralph still wrapped in the flannel cloth, and Ralph took him in his arms with the careful astonishment of a man who has never held anything so small and so important. And he stood there in his kitchen in February of 1875, with his son in his arms and his wife resting in the other room. And Devereux said later that he had never seen anyone look the way Ralph Sawyer looked in that moment. Jennie, for her part, was exhausted and triumphant, and entirely certain that this was among the best things she had ever done. She held the baby and looked at his face, this small new face that was its own person already, and felt Ralph sit down on the edge of the bed beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. "Thomas," she said softly, looking at the baby. Then she looked at Ralph. "I'd like to call him Thomas, Thomas Ralph Sawyer, if that's all right with you." Ralph looked at her. His eyes were wet and he did not try to pretend they weren't. "That's more than all right," he said. They named the boy Thomas Ralph Sawyer and called him Tom for daily purposes, and he was a good baby who slept reasonably well and ate enthusiastically, and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, and their life arranged itself around him with a naturalness that felt, once again, like something that had been inevitable all along. Spring came again. The third spring since the auction. The garden went in, and the cattle were expanded when Ralph bought 8 more head at the Wichita sale, and Devereux proved so reliable that Ralph promoted him to foreman in name and pay, and the young man nearly fell over with the honor of it and worked even harder afterward, which they hadn't thought was possible. Jennie had found a rhythm with the baby and the house and the garden, and she had also begun something new in the spring of that year. There was a woman in Caldwell, Dora Shepherd, whose husband ran the blacksmith shop, who was trying to organize a small school for the children of the area, and she'd come to Jennie to ask whether she'd be willing to teach one morning a week while Dora handled the other days, because Jennie had some schooling and the patience for it. Jennie said yes and meant it. She went into Caldwell on Wednesday mornings with Tom on her hip or later in his basket beside her desk, and she taught reading and basic arithmetic to 12 children ranging in age from 6 to 12, and she found it satisfying in a way she hadn't expected. Ralph supported all of it without qualification, which she told him once was not something she had expected but was deeply grateful for, and he looked mildly puzzled by the idea that he'd do otherwise. "You're a person with a mind," he said. "Why would I want you to keep it to yourself?" She loved him for that. She loved him for so many things by then that the list had gotten so long she could no longer see the end of it. They bought the Gerber land outright in the fall of 1876, when the lease ran out and the land agent in Caldwell told them it was available for purchase. Ralph negotiated the price down from what Morrison asked, which was fair territory, and they paid for it with the profits from 3 seasons of cattle work and a small loan from Jennie's savings that she insisted on contributing. The papers were signed with both their names on them, and when they rode back out to the Gerber land after the signing, Ralph stopped at the fence line between the two properties, the fence that now separated 2 portions of a single holding, and he said, "That line doesn't mean much anymore." "No," she agreed. He looked out over the combined land, 400 and some acres of Kansas prairie in the October light. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has built with his own hands and his own time and his own intention, and then he looked at her. "I didn't know what I was coming to build when I rode up here," he said. "I knew I was coming because of Thomas, but this," he gestured across the land and then back toward the farmhouse and barn, "this is what I built." "We built," she corrected. He smiled. "We built." The second baby came in the summer of 1877, a girl this time, born in July on a hot, bright day when the prairie shimmered with heat and the sunflowers along the garden fence were full and golden. They named her Clara Sawyer, the first name for the woman Ralph had lost to other circumstances and to time, and the middle name for Jennie's mother who had died in Ohio in the winter they were married. Clara was an entirely different temperament from Tom, quieter and more watchful, with Jennie's hazel eyes and an early inclination to study everything before she touched it. Tom, at 2.5, was fascinated and slightly territorial about his sister, which they managed with patience and consistency, and by the fall had settled into something that looked very much like protectiveness. The farm was full. The house was full. The barn, which Ralph had fully restored over the 2 years since their marriage, with proper stalls and new pegs and a swept floor and the same good ventilation Thomas had cut into the walls. The barn was full of horses and equipment and the smell of hay and leather in use. It was not empty. It would not be empty again. Life went forward in the way life goes forward in good seasons, with enough difficulty to keep it honest and enough goodness to make the difficulty worthwhile. There were bad cattle prices 1 year and a dry summer the next, and a dispute with a neighboring landowner over water rights that required a lawyer and 2 months of negotiation before it was resolved. There were illnesses, the ordinary childhood ones that came through Tom and Clara in succession, and terrified both parents and then passed, and a broken arm for Ralph in the winter of 1878, when his horse came down on the ice road near the creek and fell on him, which healed well but slowly, and drove him nearly to distraction with the enforced stillness. Jennie managed the broken arm period with a combination of compassion and firm practical authority that earned her his deep admiration and also his frustrated grumbling, which she ignored entirely. She cooked and managed the books and kept Devereux organized and read to Ralph in the evenings when his arm kept him from sleeping, and on the day the doctor said the arm was healed enough to use lightly, Ralph held it out and looked at it and then looked at her and said, "I don't know what I would have done without you." "Suffered badly and recovered more slowly," she said cheerfully. He caught her around the waist with his good arm and pulled her to him and kissed her, which the children, Tom now 4 and Clara 18 months, thought was highly entertaining. Tom made a disgusted noise that he was too young to really mean, but had apparently learned from some older child at the Wednesday school, and Ralph broke the kiss to look at his son with a raised eyebrow, and Tom giggled and ran, which Ralph could not yet chase him down to catch and knew it, which Tom also appeared to know. Jennie laughed so hard the tears came, and she wiped them and felt Ralph's arm still around her waist and thought about the first tears, the ones in the barn, the ones she hadn't been able to stop. Those tears had been grief and relief, and the end of holding on. These tears were entirely different. These were the tears that come when life is so full it runs over. By the time Tom was 5 and starting to trail his father everywhere with the proprietary seriousness of a small boy who has claimed a hero, Jennie was expecting again. She told Ralph on an October evening, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, the same porch where they'd sat through that first hard winter's evenings, and he took the news with the same quiet wonder he'd taken all the large things in their life. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. "Then how do you feel?" "Tired," she said honestly, "and glad, mostly glad." He put his arm around her. The October evening was soft and cool, and the prairie stretched south to the horizon in the last of the light. The barn stood at the edge of the lot, its gray boards silver in the dusk, its door closed and sound. She looked at it for a long moment. "I think about that day sometimes," she said. "The auction, standing in the barn." "I know," he said. "I don't think about it with grief anymore," she said. "I think about it like she searched for the right way to say it. Like a door. Like a place you stand before something opens." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "What opened?" She turned and looked at him, his face in the evening light. Those dark, steady eyes that had walked into her empty barn 3 years ago and stayed. "Everything," she said. He pulled her closer and she settled against him, and they sat in the last October light on their porch on their land, and the cottonwoods along the creek moved in the evening wind. And inside the farmhouse she could hear Tom and Clara in some small domestic argument about something entirely unimportant, and it was all exactly, perfectly right. The third baby was another boy, born in the spring of 1879, and they named him James Henry Sawyer for Ralph's grandfather and Thomas's youngest brother. James came in fast and loudly, and seemed to have decided from the first breath that the world was an interesting place that deserved his full engagement, which did not change as he grew. By this time the Sawyer spread, as people had taken to calling it, was one of the better-regarded operations in the county. Ralph had a reputation for fair dealing and good cattle management, and Jennie had a reputation for being someone you went to when you needed clear thinking and practical advice, which she did not take pride in exactly, but did take satisfaction from. She continued teaching Wednesday mornings at the Caldwell School until James was old enough to be managed without her, and then she went back, bringing the baby in his basket, and Dora Shepherd held him when he needed holding, and the 12 children were very solemn and responsible about not frightening the baby, which was the most serious and successful behavior modification Jennie had ever achieved. Tom grew into himself in ways that were both recognizably his parents' and entirely his own. He had Ralph's patience and directness and Jennie's quick intelligence and stubbornness, and at 8 years old he was already useful on the farm in ways that mattered, not just pretend useful but genuinely so. He had his father's way with horses and had adopted Ford the roan gelding, now aging but still sound, as his particular responsibility, grooming and feeding the horse with a conscientiousness that Ralph watched with visible pride. Clara was quiet and smart and intensely interested in books, which Jennie encouraged with every resource available, which in Kansas in 1880 was limited but not negligible. There was a lending library of sorts operated by the minister's wife in Caldwell, and Clara worked through it methodically and reported back on her findings at the supper table with the scholarly seriousness of a much older person. Ralph listened to her reports with genuine attention and occasionally asked questions that clearly delighted her. James was simply and unambiguously a force of nature. It was in the fall of 1880, when Tom was 5 1/2, Clara 3, and James just past his first birthday, that Warren Reed came again from Wichita. This visit was entirely different from the last. He came with his wife this time, a soft-spoken woman named Harriet whom Jennie had met twice before at Thomas's family occasions. They came for Sunday dinner and stayed the day, and Warren had clearly done some changing in the years since his worried visit to the kitchen. He watched Ralph at dinner with an expression that had traveled a long way from suspicion and arrived at something like respect. After dinner, while Harriet and Jennie sat with the children on the porch and Ralph and Warren walked the south field together, Harriet said quietly, "He's a good man, your husband." "He is," Jennie said. "Warren sees it now," Harriet said. "He was slow to come to it, but he came." She smiled. "He told me last month that Thomas would have been glad, that it was the right thing." Jennie looked out at the field where the two men were walking, their shapes small against the autumn grass, talking with the easy body language of men who have decided to get along. "Thomas would have been glad," she said. "He loved Ralph like a brother. He would have been glad they found each other." She meant that genuinely and completely. She had come to peace with all of it, with loving Thomas and losing Thomas and loving Ralph and building something new. And the peace was not the peace of forgetting, but of holding multiple true things at the same time, without needing them to contradict each other. The evening came down golden over the farm. The children played in the yard with the good-natured help of Devereux, who was 26 now, and talked about a girl in Caldwell with an expression that everyone on the farm had noticed and commented on. The horses moved in the corral. The barn stood sound and full. The farmhouse put out its warm light. Ralph came back from the field with Warren, and they came up the porch steps, and Ralph came to stand beside Jennie and put his hand at the small of her back. The quiet proprietary warmth of it, the ease of it, the 10,000 times that gesture had said everything without a word, and she leaned slightly into it. She thought about the morning of the auction. The year 1873, the year she had learned that life could end without warning and begin again the same way. The empty barn, the 43 days, the moment the door had opened and Ralph Sawyer had walked in with his hat in his hands and said Thomas was a good man in a voice that meant it. She thought about all the things she could not have known in that moment, all the fence posts and firewood and snowstorms, all the evenings in the kitchen. The rise above the creek with the cottonwood and the view, the first proposal and the June wedding and Mabel dancing at the celebration, the names of their children in her mouth, the weight of the ring, the 1,000 ordinary moments of a life shared. She had stood in the empty barn and cried until she couldn't stop, and it had been the truest thing she had ever done, because the truest grief and the truest love are made of the same material, and sometimes you can't tell the difference until you're standing in the middle of something that turns out to be both at once. The sun was going down behind the western prairie, putting everything in amber and rose, and her husband's hand was warm at her back, and her children were making the evening noise of children who have spent their energy and are approaching the hour of supper and sleep. And the barn stood at the edge of the lot, its boards silver-gray in the last light, full and sound, and holding everything it was meant to hold. "Supper," Jennie said to the porch in general, and everyone moved inside, and she was the last one through the door, pausing for a moment with her hand on the frame to look back at the barn, at the farm, at the land that stretched away in the evening toward a horizon she had learned to read as home. Then she went inside and closed the door and set her hands to the work of feeding her family, which was the oldest and the best of all the things she knew how to do. And the house filled up with voices, and the smell of the stove, and the particular sound of a life that is well and full and going forward, and every empty thing that had once been empty was empty no more. The years that followed were good years, not without hardship, because no years in Kansas were without hardship, but good in the way that matters most, measured in the ordinary accumulations of a life. Harvest seasons and winter snows and children growing taller by the notch marks on the kitchen door frame, Tom learning to rope a calf by watching his father and practicing until his arm ached, Clara reading her way through every book the lending library in Caldwell possessed and starting again, James being James, which was a full-time occupation for everyone involved. Devereux married his girl from Caldwell in the spring of 1881. A cheerful young woman named Bess who moved into the repaired Gerber farmhouse with him, and brought a kitchen garden of her own design and a great deal of useful energy to the operation. Jennie liked her immediately. She liked having another woman within easy riding distance, someone to sit with on Sunday afternoons, someone whose children, when they came, could grow up alongside hers. Ralph continued to work the land with the same steady, unhurried competence that had marked everything he'd done since the day he arrived. His reputation in the county remained solid. He served one term as a member of the County Road Commission in 1882, which he accepted reluctantly at the urging of several neighbors, and discharged with the conscientious thoroughness he brought to all things, and declined a second term because, he said, he had more useful work to do on his own land. Jennie turned 40 in the spring of 1882, which she received with equanimity, and Ralph received with a dinner that he planned and cooked himself, badly but with considerable enthusiasm, and which she ate with great appreciation for the intention. He gave her a new rocking chair for the porch, the old one having finally surrendered its structural integrity the previous winter, and she sat in it on her birthday evening and looked at the farm in the April light, and felt the fullness of it in the way that one can only feel such things when one has also known the empty. She thought, on that birthday, of the woman who had stood in the barn in 1873, who had pressed her hands together and kept herself still through the whole morning of the auction and all the 43 days before it, who had not cried until a stranger walked in and then could not stop. She was not that woman anymore. She was not entirely separate from her either. She was the woman that woman had become. Ralph sat beside her in the second porch chair as the evening came on, as he had sat beside her through every evening they'd had, and took her hand in his the way he always did, as naturally as breathing. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Anything specific?" he asked. She looked at him, at the face she had been looking at for 9 years. At the man who had walked into her empty barn in October of 1873 and stood there, hat in his hands, and not gone anywhere since. "I'm thinking that I'm the luckiest woman in Kansas," she said. He considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. "That might be overstating it," he said. "It might not be," she said. He smiled. That good, rare, face-changing smile that she had first seen in her kitchen over a bowl of stew and had been grateful for every time since. He brought her hand up and held it against his cheek for a moment. His face was warm and rough and entirely familiar. "I love you," he said, "more than the first day, and that was already more than I knew what to do with." "I love you," she said, "more than the first day, too." The prairie spread away south in the evening light. The cottonwoods along the creek moved. The barn stood at the edge of the lot, full and sound, and the house behind them was full of voices and light, and Tom's voice could be heard instructing James about something with the authority of an older brother who has decided he knows everything, and Clara's voice answered both of them with the cool precision of someone who actually does, and somewhere Biscuit moved in the corral and stamped once at a late fly. Everything was here. Everything that mattered was exactly here. Jennie Reed Sawyer sat in her rocking chair on the porch of her farmhouse in Kansas in the spring of 1882, holding her husband's hand in the evening light, and she was 40 years old, and she had built a life and lost it and built it again, and the new one was bigger than the first in every way that counted, and she was content. She was deeply and completely content, in the way that only becomes possible when you have understood both the empty and the full and know the difference between them. The stars came out one by one, and the April air was cool and soft and smelled of new grass, and turned earth and the particular clean smell of the Kansas night. And Ralph sat beside her, and neither of them said anything for a long while, because nothing needed to be said. They had said it all already, in fence posts and firewood, and sewing needles and Christmas dinner and vows spoken in a whitewashed church. They had said it in children's names and shared beds and arguments resolved, and apologies meant and laughter at the kitchen table, and the 1,000 small daily offerings of two people choosing each other again and again, morning by morning, year by year, in the way that love is not a single moment but a continuous decision, made in all the ordinary spaces of a life, until the decision has become the life itself, and you cannot any longer see the seam where one ends and the other begins. The night settled in. A coyote called from the north and was answered by another farther off. The lamp in the kitchen window burned warm and steady. Ralph squeezed her hand once, and she squeezed back, and they stayed,